Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Dangerboys podcast series. My name is Tappers, and today we're going to be talking about the Russian Revolution. Before we get into it, though, as always, just ask you guys if you wouldn't mind dropping a like, dropping a comment. If it's your first time here, please hit the subscribe button. It's something small, but it really does help me out, and I really do appreciate it. So thank you again for all the support. Yeah, so the Russian Revolution, right? We're going to be taking a look at the Russian form of government, right, before the revolution happens, kind of the Tsardom, what that kind of looks like, the reality of the situation for Russian peasants in the 17 and 1800s. And we're going to take a look at a couple different leaders of Russia over that time period of the late 1800s, a couple of wars that went on as Russia began to expand its territory. Then we're going to take a look at the economic situation and the political situation in Russia that led to the Russian Revolution. Then we're going to take a look at this guy right here on the front page. This is Vladimir Lenin. We're going to take a look at Vladimir Lenin, a little bit about who he is and whatnot. There's some other key actors, part of the Russian Revolution, who we're not going to look at in this episode, namely Trotsky and Stalin. I'm going to save Stalin and Trotsky for another episode. There, after the Russian Revolution, there's a civil war that happens in Russia, and they play a much bigger role in that. So I said I'm going to save those two for a later episode. Yeah, let's get into it. The Russian Revolution. All right, so Russian Tsarist government, right? So how was the Tsarist government run? The Russian Empire lasted from 1721 until 1917. Russia was run as an autocracy with the head of government known as the Tsar. There is no legislative authority in Russia. The Tsar could rule any way he saw fit, often appointing ministers to oversee tasks and delegate those tasks out to them. Right? So unlike Great Britain and France, who are a monarchy, with a monarchy you still have to answer to Parliament. There's still a governing body that operates with the monarch. In Russia, there is no parliament. There is just the Tsar. And so it's one of those things where the good and the bad side of it, right? So many Russian civilians saw this form of government as the most efficient way of government and looked to the Tsar as a father figure. Now, whenever you had a good Tsar who cared about the people and wanted to help them, it was great because you didn't have parliament in the way, screwing with things and whatnot. The Tsar wanted things done, and that's just how they are done now. On the other side of things, when you don't have a good Tsar, you kind of wish someone would speak up and say something on your behalf, and that you wish you had some voice in the government. And we're going to see over the course of this episode some good Tsars and some bad Tsars. But yeah, so like I said, that's the Tsar government. Like I said, there is no parliament, there is no governing body that he has to answer to. So after a series of wars in the 1800s, Russia had gained a lot of new territory, right? So in 1913, Russia had control over Georgia and Azerbaijan after the Russo-Persian Wars. And then in 1830, Russia had control of Armenia and parts of Poland. And then by 1863, there was a strategy called Russification, in which Russia attempted to stamp out Polish, Finnish, and German culture by controlling religion and language. Right? Russia does, whenever Russia conquers this territory, they want the people to stop looking at each other as Armenian and Poland and Georgian and Azerbaijan and all the other ethnic groups that live in Russia. They wanted to see themselves as Russians. And so this is one of those things, Russification, that kind of happens. And it comes back again, especially during the Soviet Union. And it rarely goes well for the Russian government whenever they try to do this. So like I said, it led to unrest in the newly gained territories, and Russification largely failed, especially in the new territories. And we see that today, where Finland identifies as Finland and not as Russian. And so in 1854, Russia took part in the Crimean War. This consisted of an alliance between the Ottoman Empire, France, the United Kingdom, and they were going against Russia. Right, the Ottoman Empire was waning. It was a very large empire that lasted for a very, very long time. And with it beginning to kind of tail off and the Ottoman Empire started to fail, Great Britain especially really wanted to try to help the Ottoman Empire stay standing because it was a stable form of government. And when Russia coming in and putting pressure on the Ottoman Empire, Great Britain especially wanted to see Russia not do that anymore, basically. And so, like I said, Russia's trying to expand into Crimea. And so, facing France and the United Kingdom and the Ottoman Empire, Russia was unable to fight the war and win. So they were forced to the negotiation table in 1856. And they had to concede a lot of territory to the Ottomans. And then Alexander II, he oversaw the end of the war after his father, Tsar Nicholas I, died. Tsar Nicholas I had passed away. And Alexander II, he admitted, actually, that we cannot deceive ourselves any longer. We must say that we are both weaker and poorer than the first-class powers. Right? They declared war, and it didn't go well. And Alexander II decides that reforms need to be made in Russia. And you can see, I put some pictures in this episode. In the top right, you can see Tsar Nicholas I riding his horse in a very Napoleonic-style uniform in the early 1800s. But yeah, so Tsar Alexander II, he is seen as a reformer, right? He's one of those good czars, kind of. We'll see how it plays out for him. So the Emancipation Reform of 1861, right? So as Tsar in 1861, Alexander II oversaw the freeing of serfs, right? This is his attempt to try to reform Russia, to try to free civilian populations, and to, become on even footing with France and Great Britain. So serfdom is a form of debt bondage and indentured servitude that is common throughout Europe and was used by the aristocracy to find labor to manage large estates, right? So whenever you are a feudal lord or just a rich guy with a lot of land, you need a way to manage that land, right? You have mines on that land, you have wood cutting on that land, not just crops, but that's also part of it too. You have to harvest crops. And you need a lot of people to work the land. And so when you're a serf, you're tied to the land, you have no rights, and so you have a bunch of free labor, basically, for these aristocracies. Well, Alexander was trying to free the serfs, right, before they decided to liberate themselves. That's something else, too, with Tsar Alexander. He doesn't want the civilian population to revolt against him, right? You want to free them prematurely. You don't want them to free themselves. And so after the loss in the Crimean War, right, he realized that Russia needed to desperately catch up, especially in the industrial sector. Tsar Alexander realizes that he needs more people in the city to work in factories, to start, like I said, manufacturing at the same level that Great Britain is. However, much of the land remained in the nobility's possession, right? So Tsar Alexander, he shows up and he says, hey, you guys are all free now. By the way, you have a bunch of debt you have to pay for, occupying the land, right? You have to pay back the nobility for leaving the land. And only a few selected serfs actually received land from the government, right? Where some of these large holdings were broken up into smaller land areas and then given to people. But on that free land that they got, they had to pay exorbitant taxes, right? So you spend all year harvesting your crops, and at the end of the year, you get to keep 10% of it, and 90% of it goes to the government in order to pay for the taxes on the land. And they said these large debts, too, that people found themselves in, so if you didn't get land, you were stuck with a lot of debt, and you had to work to get yourself out of that debt. Sometimes it took people up to 45 years, 50 years to pay off the debt that they found themselves in. So as much as they were free, they weren't free. But even still, though, right, so people were able to pay off the debts. And so people did move to the cities eventually, right? It took some time, but eventually it did work, and people were able to get off the land and go and move into cities. And this is one of those things, too, where we look at just from a pure statistical standpoint. Before the reform, only about 5% of Russian people owned land. And then by the time of the 1870s, you had almost 20%. Right, so you had like a 15% increase in the amount of land that was privatized. So, like I said, it wasn't the best. It wasn't the best strategy, but it did work to some degree. And like I said, again, we got some pictures in the top right here. You can see a bunch of serfs, former serfs, who have gone to Moscow seeking new employment and a new life. You just have them kind of wrapped up in their shawls, trying to figure out what to do next. So Russia in the 1870s, right? So in 1875, Russia went to war against the Ottomans in the Balkan crisis. This is again too, Russia is going to war again. They're trying to conquer more land, trying to get bigger. And Russia wished to see that Balkan Christians who were living in the Balkan lands were to be liberated. And they also wanted to see the freeing of Bulgaria and Serbia. Russia has a lot of really close-knit ties from an ethnic standpoint to Serbia. Like I said, Russia is made up of a lot of different ethnic minorities, but one of the biggest ones is Serbians. And so Russia has a lot of sympathy for Serbia as a nation, especially during this time period. And so by 1878, Russia had neared Constantinople, which is the capital of the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottomans were forced to surrender. This is again, too, with the Ottomans. They are a waning empire. They are no longer as strong as they once were. And so Russia beats them in this war fairly easily. And there was an initial treaty between the Ottomans and the Russians where the Ottomans were forced to give up vast amount of territories, and Bulgaria and Serbia were to become independent nations. Well, Great Britain stepped in at that point after they saw the treaty, and they met at the Congress of Berlin. And instead of Bulgaria becoming an independent nation, it instead became a vassal of the Ottomans. It had some autonomy, but for the most part, they had to listen to what the Ottomans told them to do. And again, this is one of those things where Great Britain is not trying to shake up Europe too much. They don't want to see the Ottoman Empire collapse because it's been there for so long and it's stable, despite the fact that it is waning. And so Great Britain, again, like I said, is trying to step up and say, hey, we can't be changing Europe this much. So after gaining the South Caucasus from the Ottomans, the Russians flooded the land with Christians to replace the Muslim refugees who fled the area. This mainly consisted of Georgians, Caucasus Greeks, and Armenians. Again, this is one of those things. Whenever the Russian army came marching into town, most of the Muslim population fled from the advancing Russians. And after the Muslims left, you need someone to work the land. You need someone to live there. And so the Russians, like I said, sent a variety of people. Like I said, mainly Georgians, the Caucasus Greeks, and the Armenians to take the place of the Muslims that were living there. And so in 1881, Tsar Alexander II was assassinated, and his son Alexander III took the throne. Now, his father, right, so Alexander II was the reformer. He he freed all the serfs. He was trying to be very progressive, and Alexander III was kind of the opposite, right? He decided that Russia needed to stay out of European affairs and focus on internal growth while suppressing ethnic minorities, right? Again, this is one of those things where we see with the Russification of things. Alexander III wants to see these ethnic minorities talk about each other as Russians and not from their heritage. Basically, he wants to try to erase their heritage and for them all to take on the Russian identity. With Otto von Bismarck conquering the Germanic people, Russia sought a treaty with France to prevent German aggression. It's one of those things where this all kind of ties together, and this is why I'm doing this series this way. If you go back and listen to the Adolf Hitler episodes that I did, and a little bit of the Mussolini, we're going to get into a little bit of Italy here in a little bit. But Otto von Bismarck during the Second Reich, right? He goes out and he conquers the Germanic states, and with Otto von Bismarck doing all that aggression, Russia gets very concerned about Germany getting into Poland and Russia itself. So Russia talks to France and says, hey, if Germany starts getting out of control, we have to work together to stop them, and France agrees with that. And so in 1885, an agreement was found between Russia, France, and Great Britain, which saw a halt to Russian expansion that threatened British-controlled India. This is one of those things where, like I said, Russia is very concerned about German expansion, and Great Britain's very concerned about Russian expansion. We're going to take a look at a map here in a second that we'll see where exactly the Russian territory stops. But Great Britain is in control of India at this standpoint, right? At this point in time, Great Britain controls India. And they're concerned that Russia is going to invade India at some point. They're going to go through Pakistan and Iraq and Iran, and they're going to go down into India and start taking territory away from Great Britain. Great Britain wants to put a stop to that. So this stopped the Russian expansion, but it led to defined borders, which helped ease the tensions, right? So they said with all this expansion going on and empires rising and falling, it's you look at a world map and it's kind of like, okay, where is our border at? Where are all the lines kind of deal? And this treaty between these three nations helped, really, like I said, really settle those disputes and helped everyone come to an understanding exactly where the territory stopped and where the territory ended. So it helped ease tensions a little bit in Europe over all of this expansion. So here's a map, like I said, of Russia during this time period. So if you look up here to the north, near Norway and Sweden, you can see Finland, this massive territory. And then over here on the west, you have Poland and Warsaw. And you can see here the German Empire, right? So this is one of those things, like I said, why Russia was so concerned about German. They're right on the border with Poland. And if Bismarck decides to hop over the border and try to take Warsaw, it's going to be a big problem for Russia. And we see in the south too, down where you have like Romania, Bulgaria, and then down here's the Ottoman Empire. The Caucasus are down there as well near the Caspian Sea. And then way down in the south, you can just see Afghanistan, China, and Persia. So again, Great Britain's very concerned with Russia going through Afghanistan, and then, obviously down here to the south a little bit more is going to be India. So with all this massive land territories that Russia continues to gain, Great Britain's concerned about losing its empire. So like I said, that's just a map of the world, or of Russian territory. So the failure of Nicholas II, right? So we talked about at the very beginning of the episode, we got some good czars, we got some bad czars. And Nicholas II is not a good czar. So Alexander III dies in 1894, leaving control of Russia to his unprepared son, Nicholas II. By 1890, the Russian population began to grow as better rail networks and access to new crops began to improve peasants' living standards. So Nicholas II is not prepared to lead a nation. He's just not there yet. He might never, he might not have ever gotten there. But it's one of those things too. Not only does he have to deal with running a nation, he has to run a nation that's going through massive growing pains, right? So, whenever the reforms happened, right back in the 60s, 1860, these serf populations had all of these debts they had to pay off. Well, by the 1890s, most of them had paid off that debt. And so now you have these serfs moving to the cities, more and more of them every single year. And so another thing too, whenever you're a serf, right, you are trapped to your land. You're beholden to your land. You have no real rights as a person, right? You're a serf. Well, now that you do have rights, you're allowed to go out and get a job. You're allowed to work a 9 to 5. A middle class begins to, be created in Russia. And one of the problems with the middle class from a dictatorish, czarist point of view is that people now have free time, right? They realize how much they're being suppressed and they start to make demands. They want more freedom and they want more rights. And so Nicholas is having a very hard time trying to suppress this new rising upper middle class, right? He's trying to suppress the middle class and he's having a very hard time doing that. Also, too, we just looked at the map. Russia has control of almost 23 million square miles of land, right? It's a ton of land that you have to try to keep control of. And like I said, with the rise of the middle class also comes political parties, right? People have opinions about how the government should be run, and they join together in these massive groups in order to make their voice one big loud voice, right? And so one of the two main parties that have arisen, you have on the right wing, you have the Octoberist Party, which is made up mostly of wealthy landowning aristocracy, and they begin to sell their land, right? The aristocracy, they start selling off their land because they no longer have serfs to work on their land, right? They no longer have people to do the manual labor that needs to be done on these massive territories that they own. And so instead of hiring people to go take care of whatever needs to be taken care of, whether that's harvesting crops or cutting down trees or working in mines, it's a lot easier to just sell the land to somebody else and make it their problem. And so, like I said, you have a rise of the Octoberist Party, which is made up mostly of these newfound landowners and businessmen who are saying that they want rights. They want more focus on the landowners. And on the other side of that, you have the socialist revolutionaries and the social democrats, right? The socialist revolutionaries and the social democrats. They thought that the land should be given away for free instead of being paid for. And that they also said that more emphasis should be placed on the workers in the cities. Right? The social revolutionaries and the social democrats, they're looking at the decades of serfdom and in the centuries, honestly, it was centuries of serfdom that led up to this point, where these people were putting all of their blood, sweat, and tears into this land, and now you're telling them that they have to pay for it? You should just give that to them. You owe that to them at the very least. That's the least you could do, is give them the land. And so, like I said, you have these two different political wings, right? You have the right wing of the Octoberist Party who say we should be selling our land, and you have the social revolutionaries, the left side, who are saying that the land should be given away for free. And this is, again, part of the Marxist ideals, part of the communist ideals that we're going to see a little bit later when we talk about Lenin. But yeah, so Nicholas, he found himself very ill-equipped to handle this social unrest and used recreation to escape the pressure of leading, right? So instead of dealing with his problems and trying to find solutions that it's going to make everybody happy, he decides to party instead. And whenever the Russian people get word of this, they are very upset. And so in 1905, there is the Russo-Japanese War, where the Russians fight the Japanese, the Russians lose, which is a great excuse for the Russian people to start a revolution. We're going to see a couple different revolutions during this. It's one of those things where, so when we get into the Civil War, the Russian Civil War that happens later on, we'll talk about that in another episode. But the revolution doesn't really stop in that one kind of feeds into another and feeds into another, and you have a bunch of unrest for a very long time in Russia. But yeah, so like I said, they were very upset with Nicholas, the Russian people were. He's going out and partying while we're starving in the streets, and then we lose this war. Let's do something about it. So, like I said, got some pictures. Like I said, so in the top right there, you can see this is a depiction, a painting of one of the revolutions that took place. You can just see massive people. That's something else too we're going to get into. There's so many people who get involved in these protests. So the Revolution of 1905, right? An organization calling itself the Council of Workers, also known as the Soviets, begin to appear in cities with revolutionary intent, right? You have workers who now, so you used to be a serf, now you're a worker, and these workers begin organizing themselves into unions. And the Soviets is one of the main bodies of union organization, basically. And so in order to stop the revolution, Nicholas, he orders the October Manifesto to be enacted immediately, right? Another thing, too, like I said, with the Soviet revolution that's happening, a general workers' strike is called, right? So where all the workers decide all together that they're not going to work anymore. And then again, if we go back and look at the Hitler episodes, where I talk about what's going on there in Germany, Germany faces a very similar issue after the World War I. After World War I, Germany goes on a general strike, and it's disastrous. It's the exact same situation here in Russia. And so, like I said, Nicholas, he authorizes the October Manifesto to be enacted immediately. This manifesto creates the Duma, or National Legislative Body, and no laws can be enacted without first being approved by the Duma, right? So like I said, up until this point in Russian history, there is no legislative body. In 1905, Tsar Nicholas says that there will be a legislative body. This manifesto created strife among the Social Democrats, the more radical of whom, who were known as the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks wanted more concessions, right? They said, okay, that's a good first step, but it's not enough. We demand more. And the moderate Social Democrats, known as the Mensheviks, they were relatively satisfied. They said, hey, this is a good direction we're headed in. This will be enough. You don't have to do any more. That's okay. And so, like I said, the Bolsheviks are the radicals, and the Mensheviks, they are the less radical, more moderate. So Nicholas, right? So with this October Manifesto, basically what he did was he bought himself some time. he said, hey, listen, I'm going to have a Duma in place. We're going to have a legislative body. Just give me some time to organize all of that. And then, I'll come back to you guys, basically. So in October of 1905, he puts the October Manifesto in. And then in 1906, he rewrites the Russian Constitution. And this created an upper house called the State Council and a lower house called the State Duma. Well, Nicholas, he agreed to share his power with this new parliamentary governing body by appointing members to the State Council, while the State Duma consisted of elected officials, right? So the two parties, or the two houses, the State Council is made up of members who are specifically appointed by the Tsar himself, and the lower council, called the State Duma, that is run by elected officials, right? But it's not general elections. It's mainly rich aristocracy types. I know the clergy, they had a couple votes. So it's not like every Russian citizen gets a vote. Just a few of them do. But even still, though, it's more progress than was made before. So in 1907, right, we're going back to more treaties with more countries trying to figure out land borders and whatnot. In an answer to the Triple Alliance between Italy, Germany, and Austro-Hungary, Russia joined the Anglo-Russian Convention with France and Britain. This again, too, going back to the episode I did on Mussolini, where we talked about Italy joining the Triple Alliance and how that worked out for Italy. I'm not going to spoil that here. I highly recommend you go back and listen to that episode. There should be a playlist in the description with all my episodes. But yeah, so Russia, they join in with France and Britain just in case Germany or Austro-Hungary decide to cause problems for them. They're not very concerned about Italy. Italy's kind of on the other side of the continent, so they're not much of an issue. But especially Germany and Austro-Hungary, there are a lot of tensions between those two nations. And then we can see up here in the top right, this is a battlefield. I don't know which one it is exactly. I want to say it's the Russo-Japanese War. Yeah, you just see it's interesting painting. Well, all right, so Russia in World War I. Okay, so after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Serbia refused the Austrian ultimatum, leading to the Great War. I'm not going to go into depth with World War I here. I want to save World War I for its own series and everything. But just know that Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the leader of Austria, and Serbians killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and Austria said, hey, Serbia, your people killed our leader. We demand compensation for that. And Serbia says, hell no, we're not giving you any compensation. And they said Russia was sympathetic towards Serbia. They have a lot of ethnic ties. And so as conflict began to break out between Serbia and Austria, Tsar Nicholas, he ordered 4.9 million men to be conscripted for war. Germany, who was an ally of Austria, saw this as a war measure, right? It says, hey, Russia, you're calling for 5 million men to be conscripted into the army. We're going to declare war on you first, right? We're going to beat you to the punch. And so they declared war on Russia in August of 1914. Now, like I said, I'm not going to get too far into it, but Germany did not expect Russia to be a problem as soon as it was. And so they didn't put as much focus on the Russian border as they would have if they would have known how rapidly Russia was going to mobilize. But very quickly, right? So Russia mobilizes, they invade Germany, and then they very quickly begin to lose battles. They lose battle after battle after battle. I think something like 1 million men were injured within the first year of the war. Some 200,000 were dead on the Russian side of things. And so facing a massive loss of men, Russia begins to retreat, allowing the Germans to capture Warsaw on August 5th, 1915. If we go back to that map we looked at a little bit ago, we know that Poland was under Russian control, and Germany takes over Warsaw. After suffering such mass casualties, Nicholas, he removed his generals from command and took personal command of overseeing his own troops, which led to the complete loss of Poland and Lithuania. So Tsar Nicholas says, hey, you guys, the generals, you're not doing a good job. Let me step in and show you how to do this. And then immediately loses 2 massive territories of land. So not good for Nicholas. And so in 1916, Nicholas, he had handed control of Russia to his wife while he fought the war, right? He's like, I can't run Russia and fight the war at the same time. Hey, can you, wifey, can you take over Russia for me? And she says, yeah, sure, no problem. Well, food supplies began to dry up, right? Fuel was hard to come by. As you're trying to maintain this war, you're sending more and more things to the front to help supply your armies, which means that your civilian population is running out of things, especially food and especially, like I said, coal to heat their furnaces. There was a man by the name of Rasputin who was seen as a mystic being who was controlling the empress for nefarious purposes. We're not going to go into Rasputin here. I want to do my own episode on Rasputin because he's just that interesting. But just know there was this weird mystic guy who was kind of whispering in the ear of the empress, and people don't have food, they don't have clothing, they don't have fuel for their fires, and so they make Rasputin out to be a bit of a scapegoat. So 1917 revolution, like I said, so we had the 1905 revolution, now we have the 1917 revolution. Rasputin was assassinated in December of 1916. After his murder and changes were not made, the Russian people began to blame the Tsar for their issues. They said, hey, maybe it's this Rasputin guy. Maybe he's the one that's causing all the problems. If we get rid of him, maybe everything's going to get better. Well, they murdered Rasputin, and things do not get better. Okay, well, it has to be the Tsar. The Tsar has to be the reason why we're having so many issues. So in February of 1917, with Tsar Nicholas on the front lines, the people of Petrograd began to hold mass demonstrations. Petrograd is a city in Russia. I think it's like 120 miles from Moscow. On the 18th of February, the workers of the largest manufacturing plant in Petrograd walk out of work. They walk out and they refuse to work, and now they're in the streets demanding food, demanding an end to the war. Due to heavy snow, train shipments of supplies were delayed, which led to even more unrest. More and more people are even more upset because they don't have the food and the supplies. The already limited amount of supplies that they would have had, they're not getting any of it, so they're very upset about that. And on February 23rd, International Women's Day, many women organized mass protests demanding bread. In order to try to stop this uprising, the Russian government issued rations to the people, which led to speculation over food shortages, and bread riots began to erupt all around the city. By the 24th of February, over 200,000 people had shown up to Petrograd to voice their dissatisfaction with the government and demanding an end to the war. On the 25th, right, so Tsar Nicholas, he authorized rifle fire to be used by the military to suppress this rebellion. And members of the army actually defected at this point and joined in the protest. So Tsar Nicholas is losing complete and total control of the situation. And so by the 28th, the protesters had taken over the railway stations. They'd taken over, there was an arsenal I think they raided, with guns and whatnot, and the telegraph office. And so Tsar Nicholas, he's trying to get back from the front lines to Petrograd to try to, get a hold of this situation. But he can't enter the city because, like I said, it's under the protesters' control. And so on March 1st, Nicholas, he gives up the throne to his brother, and his brother refused to take the throne because he realized that this situation was unattainable. There was no way for him to be able to save the situation, and so he was like, I will not be taking over control unless the only concession he would have made was that if the Duma would have appointed him as the leader. And I said, this is something we'll go into a little bit more during the Civil War, exactly how the Russian government collapsed completely. But yeah, just know that things are not going well for Mr. Nicholas. I'll tell you that. So now we got to look at Vladimir Lenin. Like I said, we're not going to look at Trotsky too much, and we're not going to look at Stalin really at all, but we'll take some time and look at Vladimir Lenin. So Vladimir Lenin was born in 1870, which would have been, after all the reforms happened. His parents were monarchists who tried to avoid political radicalism. It's one of those things in Russia where you don't have the freedom to speak out against the Tsar. And so basically his parents are like, listen, you put your head down, you work, and then, you live your life and you never have any issues. So that's something they try to instill in Lenin. Put your head down, don't ask too many questions, and do what you're supposed to do. And Lenin was very outspoken, right? So the words of his parents did not reach him at all. He was a very outspoken youth who was unafraid to take radical views. He had no problem speaking out against the Tsar. He had no problems being in a room and disagreeing with every single person in there. He was going to, say what he believed in, and you weren't going to change his mind on that. And so he attended Kazan University, where he organized protests, and he was actually made the leader of the protests. He was kicked out of school for this. He felt that the government was restricting student societies too much. And so, like I said, they kicked him out of school for that. And so in 1889, he moved to Samara, where he joined a socialist discussion circle, where he learned to embrace socialism and Marxism. Right? This is where he begins to take his roots in communism. His mother, again, tried to keep him interested in farming to no avail. Again, she's trying to tell him, just put your head down, work the land, and you won't have problems. And Lenin absolutely refuses to live that kind of life. So in 1893, Lenin moved to St. Petersburg and became a leading member of the Social Democrats. He ended up traveling to Switzerland. Again, we'll go back to the Mussolini episode a little bit. I highly recommend you go back and listen to that. But yeah, so Lenin, he travels to Switzerland, which is a hotbed for Marxists and communists to meet and to discuss, communism and socialism. They said Mussolini would have been there around the same time. As far as I know, they never crossed paths. But yeah, it is interesting to know that they were in the same city at the same time. Or the same area, I guess. And so he's in Switzerland. He writes down a bunch of documents and manifestos and newsletters and whatnot, trying to stir up communist agendas. And so he returns to Russia with all of this paperwork and all these flyers and everything else. And he's arrested. Like I said, you don't have freedom of speech in Russia. And so he's arrested for that. He did not try to deny the charges or anything. And while he was in jail, he saw the large numbers of former serfs moving into cities as ammunition to be used against the government, right? He saw, with communism, he saw that the workers' power comes from their ability to work. And if the people refuse to work, then it'll shut down the government. It'll shut down the country. And that's a massive weapon that he's going to be able to use later on. Like we just saw, we'll come back, we'll circle back around to the 1917 revolution, where the workers decided to stop. Like I said, Lenin is very much for that. And so in 1897, Lenin is sentenced to 3 years in exile to be served in Serbia. That's one of those things too with Russians, where not necessarily they'll throw you in jail, they'll just throw you out in the middle of nowhere, Siberia, to live out your sentence. And after his exile, he decided to travel Europe, waiting for an opportunity to overthrow the Tsar. Again, too, so the Tsar, he gets control of things, Tsar Nicholas, he gets control of things, and then things fall apart, and he gets control of things again. And so in the revolution of 1905, again, Lenin, he is not in Russia at this time, he's still in Europe. But he called for an armed insurrection and insisted that the Bolsheviks split from the Mensheviks and the Social Democratic Party, right? So the Bolsheviks, they're the extremists. The Mensheviks, they are the moderates. And Lenin is saying that the Bolsheviks need to completely and totally split from the Mensheviks and to avoid, trying to be stopped by the Mensheviks. He thinks that the more radical way is the right way. So we're going to continue on here with Lenin. By 1913, Lenin had convinced the Bolsheviks serving in the Duma to officially leave from the Mensheviks. Although Lenin was not in Russia during this time, like I said, so he's still out in Europe having his communist discussions and whatnot where he was allowed to, but he does convince the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks to split apart. By the time of the demonstrations going on in Petrograd in 1917, Vladimir Lenin was very eager to return to Russia. He says, finally, there's a revolution happening. I can help take over the government. I can overthrow the Tsar. I can't wait to get there. But of course, there's still a war going on, right? Russia is still fighting in World War I. Germany is still fighting. And so in order to get from Europe to Russia, he has to travel through Germany. Well, he gets special permission from Germany. Basically, Lenin goes to Germany, right? And he says, hey, I am not a czarist. I hate the czar. I think he's a terrible person. I think that this war is really dumb, and I'm a political leader. And I want to, if you let me go back to Russia, I'm going to try to do everything in my power to make this war stop. And Germany goes, all right, no problem. Go ahead. So he takes a train from Germany to Russia, and he arrives in Petrograd as like I said, this uprising is beginning to happen. And he begins to speak at Bolshevik meetings, condemning those who want to reconcile with the Mensheviks, right? So like I said, he convinces the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks to separate. And then some of the Bolsheviks are like, hey, we'll be more powerful if we join up with the Mensheviks. Lenin says, absolutely not. Under no circumstances should we be trying to reconcile with them. We're just too different, and they're going to just get in our way. And so, like I said, he denounces those who want to try to see a reconciliation. He also advocated for immediate peace with Germany as a new Russia under Soviet control. Right, we're going to overthrow the government, and then we're going to put an end to this war. I mean, part of that's him saying what he needs to say because he promised Germany that he would. But also, too, there are still hundreds of thousands of men being injured and dying on the front lines of this war every day. And so he wants to see an end to the war. Also, too, Lenin, he wants to call for a violent demonstration. He wants to put the provisional government to the test. Right, so after Nicholas steps down, right, after he steps away, a provisional government is put in place, right? His brother is like, no, I'm not taking the throne, and the Duma takes over officially as the only governing body in Russia, and they call themselves, like I said, the provisional government. And so Lenin is willing to put them to the test. He says, how willing is the provisional government to shed blood? Let's find out, right? And so his health begins to fail, however, right? And so before this mass demonstration, this violent uprising is able to happen, Lenin leaves Petrograd because he's feeling ill. And so while he's away, recovering his health, he hears that the violent demonstration takes place, and it did not go well. A lot of blood was shed. A lot of people died. And so after he recovers his health, he comes back to Petrograd, and he's like, hey, listen, we're not ready for the armed uprising yet. Let's be peaceful. Let's have some civility around here. We're not quite at the point to where we can have an armed uprising. But when he returned to Petrograd, he discovered that he was now a wanted man, right? Because he was the person that called for this armed uprising, right? All these people died, and it's his fault, basically, because he's the one that called for it. And so he hides out in a series of Bolsheviks' friends' houses, right? They're safe houses that he can hide out in to avoid execution. And then he escapes into Finland to await for calmer storms, I suppose, or calmer weather where he's not going to be a wanted man, or at least not as much. So the October Revolution of 1917, right? So we had the February Revolution of 1917, and now we're in October. So the Tsar has stepped down. Tsar Nicholas II is no longer in control of the government. You now have this provisional government taking its place over the summer of 1917, and by October, Lenin is ready to try his luck again at a revolution. So in August of 1917, the commander-in-chief of the Russian army sent troops to Petrograd, right? And he was seeking help from the Bolsheviks to overthrow the provisional government, right? The commander-in-chief of the Russian army also wants to overthrow the government. This is, like I said, well, we talked about it too in the Hitler trial, especially the beer hall putsch episode. We talked about how there's a lot of people that want to see an overthrow of the Weimar Republic. It's the exact same way in Russia. There's a lot of people that want to see an end to the provisional government. The Mensheviks had lost a lot of public support at this point due to their continuing support of the provisional government and staying in World War I. Basically, the people have become radicalized, right? The moderates are no longer enough for them. They want radical change, and the Mensheviks used to be the majority party, right? It's like the Bolsheviks were the extremists. They were smaller. The Mensheviks, they were moderate. They were bigger. Well, now it's flipped because people are fed up with trying to be moderates. People are fed up with trying to be peaceful. They want violent uprising, right? And Lenin understands that. And so a Bolshevik by the name of Leon Trotsky was elected to lead the Petrograd Soviet, right? This is basically the new government that's forming inside of Petrograd. Leon Trotsky is put in charge of that while Lenin is in Finland waiting, to not be executed. And so they send word to Lenin. They say, hey, the Bolsheviks are now in charge. We got the army on our side. So you can, come on back. And he does. Petrograd, Lenin comes back to Petrograd, and he called for another armed uprising. He's like, all right, this time it's going to work. I know last time we called for an armed uprising. It didn't go well. I promise you this time it's going to work. And so they took a vote. The Bolsheviks, they took a vote on it. The vote was cast 10-2, and the Bolsheviks agreed to stage an armed uprising. And so by October 24th, the Bolsheviks organized the Military Revolutionary Committee, or the MRC, and officially took key buildings in Petrograd without bloodshed, right? Petrograd is basically already in Soviet control. And so it wasn't very difficult for them to take Petrograd. Lenin gave a speech while this was happening, announcing the fall of the provisional government, and he instituted the new government called the Council of People's Commissars. This is also the progenitor to the Soviet Union, essentially. The Bolsheviks elected Vladimir as the leading chairman. Vladimir Lenin, he thought that the position should go to Trotsky, but Trotsky, he refused, and Lenin, he became the first chairman of the Soviet government. I said it's not over yet. The podcast episode is, but there's a lot of people out there, right, in Russia who do not want to see this revolution take place. And so, like I said, there's going to be a very long and bloody civil war that gets fought next, which I'll talk about in a later episode. But yeah, so that's the end of that. That's the October Revolution. A lot of turnover. A lot of people who are very upset. Bring back a little bit of the Russian music, I think. A lot of people who are very, very, very upset with the Tsar, the way the Tsar was doing things, very upset with the provisional government, and a lot of civil unrest. But yeah, that's all I got. Let's see, what else? I think I might do the Battle of Vicksburg next. I'm not too sure what I have planned as far as what I'm going to talk about next. But yeah, that's it, man. That's all I got. Well, hey, I'm out of here. And hey, namaste.